You ever hit your start button and get the dreaded tick, tick, tick? Usually indicates that your battery is going bad. You hopefully can just replace the battery, maybe jump start the bike or bump start it, get you going, and then you have no problems. Hopefully that's the easy fix for you. But on this bike, after I jump started it, I disconnected the battery cables from the jumping vehicle and the voltage dropped very quickly to 8 volts. And then as I revved it, the headlights started to flicker. That is an indication of a bad charging system. The stator and the voltage regulator are failing on this bike, so today we're going to replace those systems to make sure that this bike can run effectively, keep me safe on the roads, and not have the bike just randomly shut off. So stay tuned, we can help you figure out how to fix those things and get you back on the road soon. So getting into the charging system replacement, there are a few parts that we're going to have to replace. I'll be replacing the voltage regulator rectifier, I'll be replacing the stator, and replacing the battery. Tools that I'll need will be a torque wrench for inside the motor, a couple different size ratchets, sockets in a size 8, 10, and 17 for the oil bolt, the drain bolt, hex keys in a 4, 5, and 6, T-handles if you want something to be more convenient, air compressor just to clean out the case cover of any shavings from the gasket sealer, oil to replace the oil. Once you go back in, you'll need 2 liters of oil. I did use an impact driver just to speed things up a little bit. Loctite is important, and also not shown here is gasket sealer. You'll need gasket sealer. So for reference, this is a 2015 Kawasaki Versys 650 ABS. The stator, which is what creates the energy as the engine spins to charge the battery, is in this cover system here, so we have to remove this whole cover. However, this is in oil, so before we can get into working on replacing that, we do have to drain the oil. The easiest way to drain the oil is to remove this panel here. There's a drain bolt on this side, and then we can also change the filter. That way we just have clean, fresh oil when we fill it back up too. But on the other side up here, you have the voltage regulator that is behind this side panel right here. So we do have to remove this side panel to get access to the voltage regulator rectifier. That is what actually can take the power from the stator, convert it into the 12 volts that it needs to be to charge the battery, and keep all the systems running without it overloading anything or frying the electronics. It is always a good idea to replace both of those things at the same time. Even if the voltage regulator isn't causing any issues yet, we want to make sure we do them at the same time so it doesn't have any issues with potentially overheating the system, overloading the system, and burning out electronic systems that are not tied to those two things. It's easier, cheaper, faster just to do them at the same time. As you can see, it's draining out without touching the exhaust. You don't need to remove anything. You don't need to have it on the side stand. Being straight up on a rear stand, or if you're lucky enough to have a lift, you shouldn't have any issues with the oil coming out and touching the exhaust. Now that we've drained the oil out, we can remove the stator case cover. There are a series of size 8 bolts around the perimeter. I'm also going to remove the front sprocket cover just so I can access the wiring that runs up behind it. I believe that's also a size 8, so we're going to just pull all that off. When you go to pull off the stator cover, I'll try to get it on film too. This is magnetized. Be careful of your fingers. Don't try to stick your fingernails in there because it's going to have a lot of force to it. If you do and you start to pull it back and then it pops back in, it could hurt. So be careful as you're pulling this off. It does take a little bit of force. If it's your first time doing it, please don't use screwdrivers. Don't stick a screwdriver in there and pry it around. That will just damage the cover itself or the case, and then the gasket's not going to seal and it's going to leak oil. So anything soft, popsicle sticks, plastic, those types of things are good to use. Be careful, take your time. Before you disassemble anything, take note of how these hoses are routed through. One of the bolts that holds the case cover on holds a clamp that has one of the overflow tubes. It has the O2 sensor, and it also has the kickstand sensor in it. So as you remove it, take note of how that's routed so you can put it back together cleanly when you're done with the process and you're just putting it all back together. One also thing to note is that, like I said before, this is in oil. So after you drain the oil, keep your oil pan handy. You'll want to move your oil pan under this because as you pull this away from the engine, it will seep oil out the bottom. Even though you've just drained it, there will be still some oil residual in the case cover that will come out. Nice little leaf I've got in the front sprocket. That's cool. there is a fairing plate here, so make sure you take that off too. You kind of can't forget about it, but just keep track of that one. All right, so that's all of the bolts. It sometimes does take a rubber mallet to just tap on it to break the seal a little bit from the gasket. And then, like I said, use something soft to pry it off. Do not use a screwdriver. Please do not jam a screwdriver in there. And there's the oil coming out. Like I said, just a little bit of oil is going to drip out of there. There are also two gears here because your starter is connected up top right here. So there's two gears that then go down into the bottom part of this. So as you pull this cover off, those gears may fall out. Just be cautious of that. Try your best to pull it out smoothly, and then keep track of where those gears are. If you forget where they go, please refer back to this. I'll actually turn it around and show you where they go, or look in the service manual for the bike. That way you can see exactly where they go, how they're supposed to be situated. There's the magnet that I was talking about, pulling it right back in. All right. So we've got the starter gear stayed attached, and then there is a gear right here. Make sure that those stay where they're supposed to. And let me pull the camera off really quickly, actually. Take a look at my stator. It actually doesn't look burned. I was expecting to see some of these that are blackened, but they're not, which makes me want to refer back to the owner's manual and do a test to see what kind of output this is actually putting out. It may not be a problem with the stator. It may just be the voltage regulator. Usually you'll see a very blackened piece, one that looks like definitively burned. So let me do some further digging and see what I can come up with. We'll see what we can do. So I ended up pulling off the frame cover from the side right here, which is just a Allen key that holds it on there, just so I can get to the wiring. There is a white connector right there. I don't know if you can see it with the camera. Let me pull the camera up higher. There is a little white connector back there. That is what goes to the voltage regulator from the stator. So to remove this fully, we'll have to disconnect that, and then we can pull it away from the engine. Something to add, this gasket needs to be replaced every time you take this cover off. This is not something you can reuse. All right, so I am working off of the instructions in the service manual for testing the charging system. And even though this stator doesn't look burned, it does not pass the standard tests. So I have my voltmeter, my multimeter set to resistance. It's the omega symbol. And what I'm doing is I'm taking my leads and putting them between the contacts. And the manual states that if there is more than 0.27 ohms of resistance, then the stator is bad. I'm showing 0.44. That's across one set. If I check the other set, same number, 0.44. That is the proof I need to say that this stator is in fact burned out and bad, needs to be replaced. This is the old stator, this is the new stator. The one that I got came with a gasket to replace the gasket that was already on the cover. It was just the stator and the gasket, and I bought it on Amazon, I believe. It wasn't too expensive. I did not go with OEM. The OEM replacement is incredibly expensive, and I figured I could buy two of these for the cost of an OEM. If it goes bad again, I'll probably catch it in the short amount of time that I did this one, so I hope it's okay. I ended up getting a voltage regulator off of eBay. This one does have some damaged cooling fins, but it shouldn't impact how it actually works. So let's get that installed too. Make sure we replace all the systems at once. That way we know everything works. The current stator is held on with these 3 bolts here. There is a bolt here that holds on a metal plate that keeps the cable in place. We just have to remove those 4 bolts. They are on there with a lot of torque, so be cautious when you're taking it off. Make sure you have a good hex key on there, something that's not going to strip it out. If you need more leverage, you can use a wrench over top of it, something like that, but just be careful when you're pulling it out. I believe there's Loctite on them, so you want to make sure that they are not breaking when you pull them out, not stripping out. So I broke them loose with a T-handle or an Allen key, but I'm going to use my impact bit just to pull them out for now. There, like I said, there is Loctite on them, so it is a bit to turn. This will just make it a little bit faster. Make sure you keep that plate. Gonna need to use it again. There is silicone or a gasket sealer on the rubber piece, and it's pressed in there pretty good, so it takes a little bit of force to get that out of there. And just lift it up. There will be some oil on this too, so if you have a towel handy, that'll keep your workspace clean if you put it on the towel. I'm going to just grab some shop towels and clean out the residual oil that's in this cover. No sense in putting dirty oil back in the bike, so I just want to get this a little bit clean. And I'll take a razor blade and scrape off the gasket residue from the previous gasket, and we'll be good to reinstall the stuff. Be careful when you're using a razor blade. You can get a gasket scraper that makes it a little bit easier, but a razor blade can scratch the cover itself. So you want to make sure that you keep it parallel to the metal, so as you're moving it along, you aren't scraping the metal, you're just scraping the gasket. Now that we've got the case cover all cleaned out, I got the gasket scraped off, I blew out the cover using an air compressor to get all the gasket sealer out of there, make sure it's nice and clean. We're ready to put the new stator in. You want to keep in mind this little rubber grommet here when you're lining it up to make sure you have the right holes. This grommet needs to go into this little divot, otherwise you could have issues with it not sealing. So make sure that lines up, and then just set it in place. We're going to put the 3 screws back in, but grab some Loctite. Since there was Loctite on there before, we want to add more Loctite to it now. And you will want to grab a torque wrench too. I like to use a torque wrench when I'm doing anything that's inside of the motor. Torque specifications by Kawasaki is 106 inch-pounds per bolt. I did use the impact driver to take these out, but I would not use it to put them back in. I don't want to over torque these bolts and potentially snap the case cover, costing me more time and money. Alright, time to use the torque wrench. I did already set this to 106 inch-pounds, and this is a click type. In most of my videos, you'll see me using Harbor Freight tools. This is one of like 2 things I have from Snap-on. I did not buy this. This was a gift from somebody. Even though there is a rubber gasket here for the wiring, I am going to use some gray gasket maker to help it seal properly. I do this from the factory, might as well do it again. Make sure it sits in that divot in the cover. Kind of press it down. It'll seat better once we obviously torque everything down on the cover. But we want to make sure that gets in there. And then we can reinstall this plate. There is a locator pin. Make sure that that goes in this correct direction and it lines up with the pin, not pinching the cable. And reinstall that screw. It does take some finagling to make sure that you don't pinch the wiring, so sorry if I'm blocking the camera view. Alright, this side is done. Let's get to the bike side, scrape off the old gasket sealer, and get to installing. Just like with the case cover, we're going to scrape off the gasket sealer that's left around the perimeter of this using a razor blade. Please be very careful not to actually scratch the metal. We want to keep this as smooth as possible, but also be careful about the pieces that fall off. So as you're shaving it, try to catch it, or I'm going to have an air compressor handy, that way I can just blow things off once I get anything on the engine itself. I've never used a gasket scraper. Maybe I should invest in one. If you use a gasket scraper instead of a razor blade, let me know if it's actually worth it. When you get to this side, be very careful of the wiring. You don't want to cut the wires with your razor blade. Again, we want to make sure that this is a smooth surface, so take your fingernails, rub over it, make sure that there's no high spots or sealant left. If you use a compressor like that, don't stand directly in front of it because it will shoot oil back at you, so just be careful when you do that. All right, here's my new gasket. So since there was gasket sealer on both sides of the gasket, I'm actually going to use my fingers to apply the gasket sealer and just go around the gasket. Try not to make a big mess. This way I can ensure the gasket is properly coated on both sides. All right, now that the gasket is covered in gasket sealer, let's go ahead and put it on the case. Again, watch out for the wiring. Remember, as we go to put the cover on, it's magnetized. So hold your hand steady and try your best not to pinch any of the gasket. Remember to put these gears back in. If you did have the gears on the cover, pull them off the cover and put them back into the engine. It makes it much easier if they're in the engine, not the cover, to reinstall. I'm going to start with the locator pin on the bottom and then work my way around. Check with all the holes, making sure everything kind of lines up. All right, looks like it lines up all right. When I took the bolts out of the case cover, I put them down in this order. I thought I might have some ability to remember exactly where they went, but the parts took a little bit longer than I expected to come in, so I kind of forgot where they went. But I think I had a process in mind, and if I am remembering correctly, I started with this one at the top and then worked my way counterclockwise to the bottom. Easiest thing to remember is this plate can only go in one spot, right here. So if that's logical, that means then that plate goes on the left side, then there's two bottom ones here, there and there. Easiest way I've found to remember where they go is to just use a piece of cardboard and put the case cover around it, trace it out, and then put the bolts where they belong. Or you could just put them back in the cover, or you can put them back in the case, whatever's easier for you. I tend to do things like this because it's in an order and it's easier for me to remember, but do what works for you. So I did a short video the other day about tools that I take to the racetrack on my dirt bike. This T-handle is absolutely awesome. I love it for all kinds of things, but putting bolts back in like this, it's amazing because you can just twist it so fast. And we don't want to torque all of these down individually. We want to get them all in and somewhat tight before we start to torque. That way we don't pinch the gasket at all. So this T-handle is not necessary for the job, but I do like them a lot. we don't want to forget that clamp. I almost did. There's a clamp on the bottom one. The bottom right bolt here. I'm gonna take the camera off and show you. This bolt holds this clamp in place that holds the wiring. So we want to make sure that that goes back on before we put the bolt there. Otherwise, we have no place to retain the wires. So remember to do that at the same time, and you should be good to go. Now that we have all these on, we can go ahead and torque them down. I do like to do an alternating pattern when I do it. The manual states that this is 87 inch-pounds of torque. So check your torque wrench when you're setting these up, because it is different from the bolts on the inside. We want to make sure that it is the right torque. So even though we are replacing the voltage regulator, after we've got this all installed and all the bolts torqued down, we can install the clip back in to the port back there. Now that that's installed, we can reroute the wires back behind the clamp. Make sure that you don't have any wires going through your front sprocket. Your front sprocket runs very close to these wires, so make sure you tuck them back in behind there. Tuck them back behind there. Nice and clean. And then we can put the front sprocket cover back on and make sure that it stays contained and clean and not dangerous. Good to go. So I learned something pretty cool while I was working on this. Remember I took the big side cover off right here? It allowed me to access this bolt for the foot pegs. Something I had noticed was that the foot pegs were kind of vibrating. There's two bolts that hold the foot pegs on, here and right about in here. When we're at this point, I'd suggest taking off this little heel plate, get to those two bolts, tighten them down. Make sure that they are retorqued to spec, because mine was starting to get loose and it made the whole foot peg wobble. So keep that in mind, just check that out. Push pin that slides in, and then there is a rubber grommet that you have to push it back into. And then one bolt. All right. Now the oil level is where it should be. Now that we've got the oil back in, go ahead and put the left side bottom cover back on. All right, now that we've got the stator back in, we've got the oil filled up, we're ready to go. We got to change out the voltage regulator, which is on the other side. So I'm going to drop the lift down a little bit, pull off the side panels, change out that regulator, and we should be good to go from there. So on this 2015, the voltage regulator sits right between these two panels here, between the gas tank shroud and the side panel. I'm not sure how much I have to take off to actually get to it. It's attached to a metal bracket on the side of the frame. I might be able to just pop off a couple screws. We've got one screw up here, one screw down here, and a couple push pins. I'll see what I can do about just pulling that back and potentially getting a wrench in there to get the bolts off, but I don't think I have to take the whole thing off. So let's see what it looks like behind these panels. All right, perfect. So you can see, as I break stuff, I just pulled off a couple of the screws, and I was able to pull the panel off. I really hope I didn't break any of the push tabs when I did that. I heard something fall, but I don't know what it was. I don't see anything broken or missing. But that's the voltage regulator right there. You can see it's held on with two size 10 bolts. So let me grab a socket wrench and I'll pull those right off and swap them out. So I found out what it was that I heard that went flying. It was that I broke a little plastic push pin, and it came off of this right here. So there is a little push pin. If you're pulling off the front fairing, there is a little push pin that attaches the side fairing to the nose cowl. I have extras, but if you don't, try your best not to break them as you pull it off. But one thing I also want to note is that when I'm pulling off the side panel, I'm going to disconnect the turn signal. That way I can take the whole panel off and not have it in the way. Size 10 socket to pull off the regulator. New one going on. Simple plug and play, but always look at the connector. Make sure the connector is not burned, melted, or any issues with the wiring. Plug it in, bolt it back up. Nice and simple. There's a push pin here, 2 push pins here, and a push pin here. And then you got to make sure the tabs line up front, in the middle, and on top. Then you're all good to put the bolts back in and replace that push pin if you broke it. It is just one of these little plastic push pins that you can get at most auto parts stores. One other thing I wanted to note was I did take the old battery to Advanced Auto, AutoZone, one of those places, I forget which one, and had them do an amperage test, a load test on the battery. The old battery did fail. I'm not surprised by that. As the stator ran down, it wasn't charging the battery. The system drew all of the power out of the battery, completely drained it. So the battery had 0 power. It showed voltage, so if you checked it with a multimeter, it would show that, but a load test will show the cranking amps. If there's no cranking amps, the bike will not start. So I replaced the battery. I got one on Amazon, pretty inexpensive, but you can find them at all kinds of manufacturers, all kinds of different places to buy them. So let's put the new battery in, fire it up, see if it works. All right, moment of truth. Will it fire in the first turn? It's showing 12.7 volts on the voltmeter. Here, got a voltmeter right here. I don't know if that's gonna come across the camera. 12.6, 12.5. So let's fire, see what happens. We're up at 14.4, 14.3 at idle. That means the charging system is working now. It's putting out the correct voltage at the right RPM. All right, so the bike started on the first try. It's putting out the correct voltage at idle. It's revving fine, it sounds good. I'm just gonna top off the oil, make sure it's at the right level, put it back together, and I think we're good. I think we're done. Hopefully this helped you walk through the process. Hopefully your bike is running better now too. Thanks so much. Stay safe out there, everyone.